USS Juno, the second of the Atlantic-class cruisers, would prove to be an unfortunate ship, sunk in the same battle as her big sister with only 10 survivors. The battle that took place only 9 months after she entered service. Her life was a short one, filled with heavy combat when she saw it, that ended explosively. As a result, her legacy lies not in her service, but in how that service concluded. Not least in how the loss of 5 of her crew changed the military's approach to siblings serving together. When her life began, such a fate must have seemed to be a distant and unlikely possibility. Laid down on May 27, 1940, and launched on October 25, 1941, Juno only really stood out by virtue of the class she was in. And that's because the Atlantic class were a strange mix of compromises and differing design ideals that really deserve a longer form video to dig into. For the purposes of this video, the most important thing to keep in mind is that they were very lightly built. These were ships intended, among other things, as destroyer squadron leaders. In holding to this role, the ships were built lightly, armored with the bare minimum level of protection, and equipped with perhaps too many 5-inch guns. Certainly, there's a reason the later Oakland subclass would remove 2 of the turrets. Juno, as the second of the class, was about as baseline as a ship of this class could be. Equipped with 16 5-inch guns and 8 twin turrets for her main battery, she carried the same weaponry, if in much greater number, as the destroyers she served with. Lacking a true secondary battery, the remainder of her loadout consisted of 16 1.1-inch cannon and 4 quad mounts, alongside 8 20mm cannon. Somewhat at odds with American cruiser practice by this point, she rounds that out with 8 21-inch torpedo tubes and some depth charges and assorted launching equipment. Fitting for the role of leading destroyers, I grant you, but very non-standard by this point. That out of the way, Juno was commissioned on February 14, 1942. There's a reason I'm posting this video today in my time zone. Now, with the sudden outbreak of war a couple months prior, Juno would have an abbreviated and rushed shakedown period. Setting out on her training and shakedown cruise on March 22, 1942, she would only get a few days of practice before getting thrown right into actual service. Namely, on March 28th, there was a report of a potential submarine prowling about nearby. On March 29th, Juno set about looking for that submarine. This involves steaming into fairly rough weather and heavy seas, being forced to use her still new radar to try and spot the sub. Early that morning, she made a contact on her radar about 800 yards away. I suppose it's telling how bad the weather was that they had to rely on the radar for something that, in nautical terms, is point-blank range. Unfortunately for Juno, if there ever actually was anything in that storm, she proceeded to miss it with 3 barrages. Or, at the least, there was no discernible result to speak of. With how new and untested the ship and her equipment was, however, I cut her some slack. There might not even have been a target to attack, as glitches in radar were hardly uncommon at the time. The concussion of her depth charges, on the other hand, that's a bit harder to forgive, considering it succeeded in opening circuit breakers aboard the cruiser, which resulted in her losing steering control. I suppose that's a good thing to figure out in home waters. Anyway, with that excitement out of the way, she returned to her shakedown and training. A couple incidents here and there would add to the excitement and cut out some of the monotony of gunnery drills and the like, such as steaming to answer a distress call from a merchantman or picking up the crew of an overturned aircraft. Such things really aren't out of the ordinary in wartime. What is a bit more out of the ordinary is steaming along on April 25th, when she managed to detect 2 apparent underwater explosions that shook the ship about as bad as depth charging, as well as the sound of gunfire to the northeast. Poor visibility once more struck the ship, so she couldn't identify exactly what was going on. The fact she picked up a German radio signal, presumably a U-boat, about 15 miles away probably gives a clue. Regardless, with her shakedown mostly done by this point, the cruiser would set off to San Juan, arriving in early May. In this, she was joining efforts to keep an eye on Vichy French assets in the Caribbean, which included such things as France's only aircraft carrier and a couple light cruisers. While she would spend the first 2 weeks of May doing this duty, it would ultimately turn out that the French would make no attempt to escape. Juno was, thus, released from this duty on May 14, 1942. She would arrive back in New York for an overhaul on May 21st. That overhaul was the formal end of her Shakedown cruise. For that entire thing I just went over, Juno was technically still on Shakedown. That's wartime for you. After she came out of that overhaul, the cruiser would spend June through the start of August on various patrol and escort duties in the Atlantic. There was the odd moment of excitement in relation to U-boats, but Juno would both avoid damage and avoid dealing any damage. Considering her ultimate fate, it's not a great sign that she struggled with actually sinking a submarine when she did engage contacts. At any rate, this period saw little in the way of excitement, so we'll move on to her very short but exciting Pacific service. Arriving in the South Pacific at the end of August, Juno joined up with other American ships, including the battleship South Dakota, for service. She would once more be performing her escort role when, well, her bad luck with submarines reared its ugly head again. For on September 15th, 1942, we get to the sinking of USS Wasp. Juno was escorting Wasp from about 2,500 yards away when the torpedoes from the submarine I-19 slammed into the carrier. I already have a video on Wasp, so I'll just say this. She got hit in about the worst possible place and promptly burst into uncontrollable flames. Juno would immediately be sent after the submarine, but in spite of laying some depth charges, she would make no hits. Instead, the cruiser would stick close to the carrier as she was abandoned, and her survivors were plucked from the water. When Wasp was ultimately scuttled, Juno would help pick up any other remaining survivors before booking it to safe harbor. She arrived at such on September 16th, dropping off the wounded and other survivors she had picked up. Promptly ordered back to sea, Juno would leave the following day, setting out to join the screen of USS Hornet, where she would have 2 further failed attempts at attacking supposed submarine contacts over the next few days. The next month or so after that would be fairly uneventful for the ship. She escorted Hornet on various missions, but enemy contacts were few and far between. It wouldn't be until the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands that Juno would see combat again. That was on October 26th. Juno would still be escorting Hornet during the upcoming battle, which would see another carrier shot out from under her guard. Not for lack of trying to prevent it. Juno and her fellow escorts shot down some 20 planes. Unfortunately, that was not enough to prevent damage to Hornet. Some of the Japanese attackers still got through. Crippled by these hits, the carrier would be tied up to USS Northampton, while Juno and the others kept up their flak screen. Alas, Juno would be ordered to join up with USS Enterprise's escort at this point. She would thus not be present when further attacks damaged Hornet, to the point of being abandoned and left adrift. Over the course of this battle, protecting both Hornet and Enterprise, Juno fired off some 665 rounds of 5-inch ammunition. With the Japanese pushed back, however, if only for a moment, Juno would join a convoy of reinforcements for the men ashore on Guadalcanal. Leaving for that on November 8th, she would help fend off further Japanese air attacks. Juno claims 6 torpedo bombers alone, which isn't a small feat at this point in the war. After these attacks, most of the American warships left the area, but Juno was one of the 13 to remain. It would be these ships, including both Atlanta and Juno, that engaged the Japanese overnight on November 13th. This battle would quickly devolve into a free-for-all melee that was quite messy. The Japanese ships, including the battleships, or battle cruisers depending on your view, Hiei and Kirishima, came out of a rain squall basically on top of the American formation. While the Americans had the advantage of radar and at least knowing that something was coming, the Japanese were caught by complete surprise. Their fleet was something of a mess, expecting to do shore bombardment, not engage in enemy formation at point-blank range. Still, with both sides flailing about in confusion, you get one of the more chaotic battles at sea in history. Leaving aside a mess of near collisions on both sides, the two fleets would soon be hopelessly mixed together. Every ship had to fend for herself. Atlanta, in particular, would suffer the misfortune of being fired on by both sides, suffering friendly fire from USS San Francisco. As for Juno, well, Juno will be hit early on by a torpedo from a Japanese destroyer. Sources conflict here on which destroyer did it. It's generally accepted to be either a Matsukaze or Murasame. I suppose it doesn't matter much which particular ship landed the blow, because the torpedo would cripple Juno regardless. It blew depth charges overboard and wrecked her steering, such that she almost collided with Helena. By some miracle or another, that was avoided, and the crippled cruiser limped out of the battle. While that battle continued behind her, repairs were done to try and keep Juno afloat and somewhat functional. She would not be present for the remainder of the action, nor the efforts to rescue survivors from the water. Her captain had set her on a course towards a nearby island in hopes of more substantial repairs. She was steaming on just one screw at this point, and it would have been nice to have, well, more functional propulsion before making a dash for safe harbor. By the time the sun rose, Juno would join up with fellow survivors, San Francisco, Helena, and a couple destroyers. She struggled along in formation with the other ships, listing and down by a dozen feet on her bow. Some of her medical detachment were transferred over to the heavy cruiser nearby, which, considering events to come, you can say they got lucky. Because the submarine I-26, which had previously torpedoed USS Saratoga, had crept up on the formation of cripples. She fired 3 torpedoes at San Francisco, the largest target. 2 missed entirely, though one narrowly missed Juno's stern. The third also missed its intended target, but slammed directly into Juno, very close to where she had been hit the previous night at that. The light cruiser, built lightly even by the standards of her type, was already struggling to stay afloat. The sudden impact of another torpedo, so close to where the first had hit, doomed her. A massive explosion engulfed the ship. So massive and powerful was this blast that Juno sank in less than a minute. Aboard the other ships, the general opinion was that no one could possibly have survived such destructive force. They left the area swiftly as a result, as well as because of the fact that of the ships, only USS Fletcher had the ability to engage the clearly hostile submarine lurking nearby. This isn't even touching on the risk of air attack or lurking surface forces. Was this decision the correct one? From a pragmatic perspective, absolutely. It preserved the other ships and avoided another tragic loss. In spite of that, it would leave some 100 or so of Juno's crew stranded in the hostile waters. Because not all of them had died when their ship blew apart. Many of those who did survive were wounded to varying degrees. Some severely enough, missing limbs and the like, that they were probably doomed even had the other ships stuck around. The men in the water, at least according to the few survivor accounts we have, say they understood why the other ships left. They also say that a B-17 flew overhead and made it clear it had spotted them on the first day. Yet nothing would come of that. For all that the men were confident that they would soon be rescued, they were not. By the time the last survivors were plucked from the water, a week later, only 10 would ultimately survive. 10 out of at least 100. It's a tragedy that the men weren't rescued sooner, even acknowledging the mitigating circumstances, on par with that of the later sinking of USS Indianapolis. In the end, 14 of her crew would survive. The 10 who survived the direct sinking, and the 4 who had gone to San Francisco beforehand. Among those lost, were the 5 Sullivan brothers. At the time, while it was certainly frowned upon, the Navy did not prevent all the brothers from serving together. They had pushed to be allowed to serve together on the same ship, and unfortunately would end up dying together on the same ship. Reports conflict here. 2 certainly went down with the ship. 2 of the brothers might have ended up in the water, only to die shortly afterwards. Or maybe one of them went down with the ship with the other 2, and the other one died in the water. Considering how few people survived, the reports here are very fragmentary and conflicting. What we can say with almost complete certainty is that the eldest brother, George Sullivan, is the one who ended up in a raft and definitely survived the initial sinking. However, at some point after the sinking, he began acting strangely. He stripped his clothes, proclaimed he was going to take a bath, and jumped into the water. He would drift along before... Well, sharks were a constant threat to the survivors. Obviously, no one can know what was going through George's head. Delirium from lack of food and water, and exposure, was a real threat. It is also possible that he was deeply, deeply traumatized by the loss of all of his younger brothers. We'll never know for sure. With his death, all of the brothers went down with their ship, even if it wasn't immediately. This tragedy would see reforms intended to prevent such a thing from ever happening again, including the sole survivor policy. The Sullivans would, ultimately, be honored by 2 destroyers named USS The Sullivans for all of the 5. A Fletcher-class destroyer that is still around as a museum ship, and a Burke-class destroyer still in service to this day. Juno would also see her name carried forward through 2 ships, including the lead ship of the Juno-class cruisers, themselves improved Atlantas. The wreck of the first Juno, for her part, would be found in pieces by RV Petrol in 2018. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.